Owens Valley is at the western edge of the Great Basin Desert. It's a deep trough formed by the Sierra Nevada on the west and the widened Inyo ranges on the east. Because of its desert climate, the first Euro-American settlers who arrived in Owens Valley in the 1850s were amazed at the extensive meadows, which covered thousands of hectares. Meadows were sustained by shallow groundwater, and in places enhanced by networks of irrigation ditches dug by Native Americans. The shallow groundwater arose from snowmelt percolating down from the Sierra Nevada. In the 1860s, the Euro-American settlers called in the U.S. cavalry to forcibly subdue Native Americans and take over their lands and irrigation ditches. In the 1920s, having used controversial means to acquire land and water rights, the city of Los Angeles called in armed detectives to forcibly subdue the settlers' descendants and take over their land and irrigation ditches. Los Angeles also built its own ditch, now known as the Los Angeles Aqueduct. It currently supplies from 1 to 2/3 of the drinking water for the entire city. In 1970, Los Angeles enlarged its aqueduct by over 50%. To help fill the enlarged capacity, it greatly increased Owens Valley groundwater pumping, which caused dramatic impacts. Inyo County sued under the California Environmental Quality Act, and this litigation in various forms continued for 19 years until it was settled with the signing in 1991 of the Inyo-LA Long-Term Water Agreement. We will present a case study in management under this agreement. The details of the water agreement are numerous, complicated, and confusing, but the underlying concepts are not. The goal is to avoid certain described changes and other significant impacts to the Owens Valley environment while providing a reliable water supply to Los Angeles. In other words, sustainable management. How could this possibly be achieved? First, by lowering expectations. The changes and impacts that were to be avoided would be measured relative to conditions documented by Los Angeles in the mid-1980s after massive pumping had been going on for over 14 years. Neither party had any illusions that they were trying to maintain pristine conditions. Impacts would be avoided by exploiting the drought hardiness of well-filled vegetation. It was thought dominant species could tolerate 1 to several year cycles of drawdown and recovery. In other words, ecosystems would be subject to managed groundwater drought. The drought recovery policy was also added as an insurance policy. Los Angeles had pumped record volumes of water during the unmanaged climatic drought of the late 1980s while the water agreement was being negotiated, and created enormous drawdowns. The drought recovery policy explicitly called for recovery of soil moisture to vegetation rooting zones, and was a further constraint on pumping beyond the water agreement's basic protocol. Our study area is in central Owens Valley. It consists of 2 parcels of homogeneous vegetation outlined in green on the right. The parcels were circumscribed and inventoried for species, composition, and cover by Los Angeles in 1986. The cover and composition data define baseline conditions and management goals for the water agreement. Both parcels were dominated by the grasses Sporobolus aroides and Disticus spicata, and the southern parcel had higher cover than the northern one. Here, parcel boundaries are superimposed on a 1912 map by Los Angeles' consulting engineer Charles Lee. The tan diagonal hatch marks in Lee's map indicate meadow vegetation, part of a much larger area. Vegetation to the west of the meadow is dominated by shrubs. Lee observed that the grass-shrub ecotone was very close to the 8-foot depth-to-water contour. He commented on the striking correlation between vegetation and depth to water, and observed that the meadow zone occurred in areas where average depth to water was no deeper than 8 feet. Lee not only mapped vegetation and depth to water in space, he also documented changes in time. This hydrograph shows depth to water at 2 test wells over a 3-year period. The top line represents the ground surface. Units on the vertical axis represent feet, and on the horizontal axis months. Each spring, as the growing season starts, plants and sunshine suck water out of the ground through the process of evapotranspiration, lowering the water table several feet. Each autumn, as the growing season ends, evapotranspiration slows and water tables are recharged. The regular pattern in the hydrograph is characteristic of the meadow zone. Under the water agreement, annual cycles of drawdown and recovery driven by evapotranspiration would be replaced by 1 to several year cycles driven by groundwater pumping or managed groundwater drought. Here are some actual hydrographs from the study area. Units on the vertical axes are in meters instead of feet, and units on the horizontal axes are in years instead of months. The bottom hydrograph shows the test well at TS3 just outside the southern parcel. It shows 2 cycles of drawdown and recovery. This hydrograph is typical of wells in the southern parcel. The top graph shows hydrographs from test wells at monitoring sites TS1 and TS2 in the northern parcel. Both wells show deep drawdowns from pumping during the late 1980s drought. Recovery to the grass rooting zone, about 2 meters for native groundwater-dependent species, has yet to occur. Hydrographs of these 2 wells are typical of wells in the northern parcel. Management of these parcels constitutes an unplanned experiment testing the water agreement's conceptual model. The southern parcel was managed in compliance with this model of cycles of drawdown and recovery, while the northern parcel was not. We can also see this unplanned experiment from a top-down view. The 8-foot depth-to-water contour which Lee associated with the grass-shrub interface is highlighted in blue on the map at the left. In the air photo at right, the 1912 location of the 8-foot contour has been mapped along with its location in 1986 and 1990. It migrated at least a kilometer to the southeast between 1986 and 1990 and has never returned to its original position. It simply fluctuated around its 1990 position. That means the northern parcel has been continuously managed in a way that ought to favor shrubs over grasses according to Lee's model. The southern parcel, on the other hand, has been managed in compliance with the conceptual model of the water agreement. This image shows results of spectral mixture analysis of Landsat data. The data were provided by Andrew Elmore of the University of Maryland. Estimated live cover declined from 47% to 19% in the non-compliant parcel between 1986 and 2006. This was a relative decline of over 50%. In the compliant parcel, estimated live cover only declined from 58% to 51% during the same period. These graphs show the ratio of grass cover to shrub cover over time. A value of 1 means all grass and no shrubs, while a value of 0 means all shrubs and no grass. In the top graph, the green line represents permanent monitoring site TS3 in the compliant area, shown on the bottom of the map. It shows a slight decline. The red and orange lines represent permanent monitoring sites TS1 and TS2 in the non-compliant parcel. They show dramatic declines, indicating shrubs have become dominant. The bottom graph shows the average grass-shrub ratio for each parcel for each year. 12 to 26 transects are randomly placed and read each year in each parcel to calculate these averages. The green line represents the average for the compliant parcel. There is no significant trend over time. The red line represents the average for the entire non-compliant parcel. There is a significant downward trend indicating increasing shrub dominance. The trends at both spatial scales, permanent monitoring sites and entire parcels, are similar. The non-compliant monitoring sites and parcels show rapid conversion to shrub dominance, while the compliant monitoring site and parcel do not. Some of the underlying processes can be seen by examination of grass cover at permanent monitoring sites. This graph shows TS3 in the compliant area from 1988 through 2007. Grass cover bounces up and down, but shows no obvious trend. The site is buffered by relatively shallow groundwater. Grass cover at permanent monitoring site TS2 in the non-compliant area looks quite different. It shows a significant downward trend over time. The water table has been drawn down continuously since 1989. The downward trend in grass cover represents the loss of the buffering effect of shallow groundwater. Here we have added precipitation to the graph of grass cover in the previous slide. Grass cover is equilibrating with precipitation without buffering by shallow groundwater. Because average precipitation is only about 11 centimeters a year, management goals for grass cover cannot possibly be met. On July 7, 2007, a lightning fire burnt about a third of the study area shown in hatch marks on the map. It burnt both monitoring sites TS1 and TS3, which allows us to look at effects of fire at both shallow and deep ends of the depth-to-water gradient. Results are best seen in photographs. Monitoring site TS1 is on the left and TS3 on the right. Groundwater at TS1 has been drawn down continuously since 1989, while TS3 has had 2 cycles of drawdown and recovery. We showed hydrographs for these sites in a previous slide. The top photos show the sites when they were newly established in 1988. The numbers between the photos are the grass-shrub ratios. In 1988, ratios for both sites were similar, as was total grass cover. The bottom photos show the same monitoring sites 19 years later, just before the fire in 2007. Shrubs have encroached at TS1, and there is virtually no living grass. The grass-shrub ratio has declined to less than 0.1. At TS3, grass cover is close to what it was in 1988, as is the grass-shrub ratio. The top photos show the monitoring sites about 2 weeks after the fire. The bottom photos show the sites a year after the fire. At TS1, noxious weeds such as Salsola species or tumbleweed and Bromus rubens, red brome, have started to invade, and there is very little native grass. At TS3, grass recovery is so robust it's hard to tell a fire occurred. The top photos are the originals from 1988. The bottom ones were taken this year, 2009, 21 years later. At TS1, the green in the bottom photo is almost entirely tumbleweed. TS1 has been subject to continuous groundwater drought since 1989, and it's a management disaster. At TS3, in the bottom photo, grass cover is higher than when the site was established. TS3 has been managed in compliance with the conceptual model of cycles of drawdown and recovery, or managed groundwater drought. The results of the unplanned experiments in groundwater management and response to fire are dramatic, but not surprising. The idea that continuous drawdowns diminish grass and foster shrub encroachment follows from the observations of Charles Lee in 1912, and people have known for thousands of years that fire can regenerate well-watered meadows. The case study is noteworthy not because the results are unexpected, but because it raises the question of why some areas are being managed in ways guaranteed to produce precisely the results the water agreement is intended to prevent. This question can be answered at many levels of detail, but the simplest answer is that a spatially consistent application of the biological model of cycles of drawdown and recovery would require Los Angeles to pump less water, thereby reducing flow down the aqueduct. This graph from Los Angeles' 2008 Owens Valley report shows annual pumping since 1970. You can see the spike in pumping during the late 1980s, which caused the enormous drawdowns in the study area and elsewhere. The average annual pumping since the mid-1980s, the baseline period for water agreement management, is about 93,000 acre-feet. The problem is that the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that long-term average pumping should not exceed 70,000 acre-feet a year if sufficient water is to be provided to maintain baseline vegetation conditions. That's an annual excess of about 23,000 acre-feet, and it's worth over $18 million a year at today's prices. How can excessive pumping continue when the water agreement calls for sustainable management? Unfortunately, there are many ways, and in the remainder of this presentation we will give a few examples. The first is the use of brute political and legal force. In 2000, Los Angeles hired consultants to evaluate the drought recovery policy. The consultants concluded that criteria for terminating the policy had been met. They reached this conclusion by decoupling management from biology. Although the policy's explicit goal is recovery of soil moisture in vegetation rooting zones, the consultants decided it could be terminated upon recovery of just 80% of the groundwater drawdown, regardless of condition in rooting zones. Los Angeles then unilaterally terminated the policy over Inyo County's strong objections and awarded consultants a multi-year contract worth over $20 million. Another example is the use of mitigation projects to shield exports. When Los Angeles increased its pumping in 1970 to help fill the enlarged capacity of its aqueduct, it dried up Black Rock Spring. Water from the spring, about 8,100 acre-feet a year, formerly flowed through Black Rock Fish Hatchery, then directly into the aqueduct. To mitigate the drying of the spring, between 12 and 13,000 acre-feet of water a year are pumped through the hatchery. Simply reducing pumping to 8,100 acre-feet a year, the amount of the former spring flow, would provide the hatchery as much water as it was built to use, and also allow water table recovery under the case study area. Reducing pumping for the hatchery, however, would also reduce flow into the aqueduct. Although Antonio Villaraigosa, the current mayor of Los Angeles, and his appointees have repeatedly claimed their absolute commitment to their environmental protection obligations in Owens Valley, their predecessors made no such commitments. In this example, then-chairman of the LA Board of Water and Power Commissioners, Dominic Rubalcava, made increased water exports a condition of renewing the lease for the city of Bishop Airport. Unfortunately, nothing will prevent future water and power commissioners from reverting to this kind of behavior. By 2005, Inyo supervisors had a backlog of a dozen water management disputes with Los Angeles. Most of the disputed activities had led to increased flows down the aqueduct. Most of the disputes remain unresolved this year, 2009. Acquiescence is easier than resistance and doesn't cost the county money. Sustainable management is eroding away. The water agreement was undermined from its inception by enormous drawdowns caused by pumping during the unmanaged climatic drought of the late 1980s. Full recovery has yet to occur. Our case study shows the agreement's conceptual model of cycles of drawdown and recovery, or managed groundwater drought, can meet the agreement's goals, but it hasn't been consistently applied. The problem is not a lack of ecological understanding, but a lack of political will to face the inconvenient truth that sustainable management will reduce flows down the aqueduct. People hoped the water agreement would end years of hostility between Inyo and Los Angeles. Its implementation instead has turned into a lesson in the difficulty of attaining environmental justice in the presence of huge disparities in financial and political power. We would like to acknowledge Andrew Elmore of the University of Maryland, John F. Mustard of Brown University, the Inyo County Water Department, the University of California White Mountain Research Station, the Big Pine Paiute Tribe of the Owens Valley, the Bristlecone Chapter of the California Native Plant Society, and the Inyo Register.